I run a startup now where you're like, oh man, how do you take on all this stress and whatever? Like running a shift on Friday night and like trying to keep the drive through clear. It's like the most intense shit you could ever go through in your entire life.
Hello and welcome to Graduate Theory. Today's guest is a former banking manager who's on a mission to revolutionize the industry of chat. He's a former COO of Vid and a founding partner at asset management group Nebula Ventures. He's now the CEO and co-founder of ThisApp, an all-in-one chat platform that makes it easy to connect with anyone and organize anything. Please welcome to the show today, Robby Wade.
Hi, James. Thanks for the kind intro. Thank you for preparing that. I really appreciate it.
No, no,
Where would you like to start?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'd love to sort of wind back the clock back to when you sort of left university and started working. And you actually used to work at NAB, and I'd be interested to hear kind of this whole journey of, you know, NAB to CEO in Silicon Valley. It's quite a unique trajectory that you're on. But yeah, like, what was kind of the story there in terms of leaving NAB and then going into some of these other things where you're sort of in startups and trying a bunch of things. How did that story kind of start for you?
Absolutely. I'll go back a little bit just to offer some more context. My parents basically had a small business while we were growing up, and so we kind of grew up in the factory where they worked, driving around in forklifts and whatnot. They sort of sold gas heaters and wood heaters in the winter, and solar hot water and whatnot in the summer. And I kind of quickly realized that I never wanted to run a business. In that sense, we would be there 7 days a week and working with them and helping them unload trucks and whatnot. So I decided to go to uni, and I studied economics and finance, and I went to uni for 3 years, but I didn't end up graduating. I had about 4 or 5 subjects to go, and I was working as a teller at NAB at the time, and actually got a job. I got offered a job in the private bank, and that required a degree to get into that job. And so I ended up in this weird position where I had a job that required a degree, but I didn't have a degree yet. And then I just sort of kept getting promoted and going through my career. And it just got to a point where I was like, I don't really know what I need the degree for, because I'd gotten to the degree is to kind of get you your first job, but then you get a job that requires a degree and no one ever asks you for it ever again. And so I spent a lot of money and didn't end up with the piece of paper, and I did a lot of work. I wasn't kind of like one of those romantic uni dropouts. I worked incredibly hard over 3 years to try to finish that off, and then I got the job, which was the good part, and I went back to uni to ask them if I could, do a test or something and just get my certificate. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But yeah, to answer your question more directly, I'd been working at NAB for quite some time, and I had been investing in cryptocurrency. A good friend got me into cryptocurrency quite early, and this was around, I think maybe it'd either have to be late 2015 or early 2016. And in the bank back then, if you think cryptocurrency is controversial now, like back then it was even more for like people who were buying drugs and all of those kind of things. So that was, there was very few people in the bank that actually were involved in crypto and whatnot. And so my business partner that I founded ended up founding Nebula Ventures with James Kazinas. Actually started an advisory firm. He got an opportunity with a few clients overseas, and because I was the only other person that he knew something about crypto, he sort of invited me to join him in starting this advisory business. And what that meant was we were essentially advising cryptocurrency companies on like making pitch decks and financial models and all of these kind of things. And so, one day I was working in the bank, having the time of my life, and living in, Sydney. And, I worked in at NAB. It was kind of the glory days of banking. They sort of called it. My One of my old bosses said it wasn't a job; it was a lifestyle. Like, we sort of went to lunch with clients and built really good friendships with them, and it was an incredible experience for me. Leading that experience there led to fundraising later as a startup, because my I worked in the private bank at NAB, so I got to be around a lot of high net worth individuals, and I learned how to interact with them and speak to them and build relationships with them. And you kind of realize that rich and successful people are just like you. They have the same problems as you, and you just kind of have to be normal around them and whatnot. So that was an incredibly important part of my journey. But all of a sudden I just quit my job, and we were on a plane to the first client we had. We met them in Europe, and we flew all around Europe, and then went to Asia, and ended up in the States, and did various different speaking gigs, and worked with different clients who were launching tokens. And yeah, it was an absolute whirlwind. Like, I didn't grow up as your typical entrepreneur. I was kind of the opposite. It's not like I started selling T-shirts or whatever it was. Like, my parents were very entrepreneurial, and I was sort of adverse to it because I grew up in an environment where you were just constantly working in the business and whatnot. But it's kind of like they have a saying, mirror, mirror on the wall, I'm like my father after all, or whatever it may be in
Mm.
some capacity. So it was in my blood, and once I sort of took that dive, it just never stopped. It just kept going. And I can go keep. Do you want me to keep going through to how this app came to be?
Yeah,
From there?
well, I think maybe we'll pause and ask you to go into some of that in a bit more detail. What like traveling around and seeing like most people and stuff, does that do you still use like those kind of skills and the things you picked up, like you said, now you learn a lot from like how to sort of operate around certain individuals, and then I guess like the pitching and stuff that you saw when you were doing crypto as well, there's a lot of that parallels to even what you do now as well. It's interesting how like all the things you've done
Absolutely. Like, I
previously just kind of
mean,
build. Mm.
it's actually not that different. Like, in terms of like when you're in the bank and you're trying to get a high net worth individual to invest in one of the bank's products, or you're trying to get them to refinance their loans across to your business, or restructure their family portfolio, or build a relationship with them, it's exactly the same set of skill sets that like I needed to use in order to get investors to invest in this app, for example. And very recently, we weren't going to have we weren't going to introduce the concept of the token as early as we did in this app, and then sort of Web3 had sort of accelerated over the last sort of like year or two in the venture funding space, and all of a sudden I had to write some token economics and write a token paper and whatnot. But like, I'd done that in my advisory business. That's what we used to do for companies, and
Mhm.
we used to build their burn rates and their cap tables. And so bringing that into like our company now, like all of those skills have like definitely transcended over. And but the funny thing is, like, along the way, you don't really realize that that's actually happening in that sense.
Mm.
It's just sort of like slowly manifesting. But yeah, I take a lot of pride in building very deep relationships with our investor base, and it's kind of like an uncommon experience for them, where I've gone out of my way to build very deep friendships. And I don't do that. I don't do that for any other reason than that's just what I've always done. Like, in the bank, our job was to maintain the relationships with these sort of high net worth individuals, and a lot of them have remained friends to this day, just because of the depth that you go to. So it's sort of just continued in the same process throughout that journey.
Mm. Yeah, that's super cool. Super cool. And then, yeah, tell me, I want to hear the story now of like starting this app because, you know, crypto and all that stuff, really cool. But yeah, what was kind of the thing that happened to get you into
Yeah,
this
I
app
mean,
and on
there's
this
a
journey?
little. I guess I'll keep going in the story I was telling before, because it sort of leads into this app, and there's a fair bit of context that needs to happen there.
Yeah.
Um, so we did the advisory stuff for about a year and a bit, and a year and a half, and then we met Adam Gahar, who you've interviewed on the podcast before. And Adam Gahar is an incredible person who has changed my life and my business partner's life in a number of different ways. And basically, what Adam did was he kind of said to us, like, I think you two are great. Like, come and work for me. And we were like, look, man, like, we just quit our jobs and traveled the world and did all these amazing things. Like, we don't really want to work for anyone. And he was like, well, how about we partner with you? And so we ended up partnering with Adam. And Adam, what's the most humbling thing in the world is Adam essentially invested in James and I instead of investing in an idea. So he basically just said, look, I really like you guys. I want you guys to go and find a business that you really like. And so we worked with Adam, and went around and worked with a lot of interesting projects during that phase. And in the end, we didn't end up partnering with Adam on a business. And he backed us for a couple of years, and that's an investment that I'll sort of never forget. He sort of invested in me as a human, and I feel incredibly lucky to have had that opportunity because the experiences I had in that time, were unbelievable in many different aspects. And you've met Adam; he's an incredibly
Mm.
deep person, and there's a lot to learn from him. Um, and so we did that, and then I ended up going into a startup that I'd known from the crypto time. That was Vid. I went into Vid when there was only like I guess 4 or 5 people there, and we grew that team to over 50 people, and we launched our token on a couple of exchanges around the world. But that was such a remarkable experience because I was a banker and then I went into advisory. And then I was always sort of like on the other side of the table to the builders, where Vid was the first time I actually went in deep into a company and was involved in the product. And I was lucky enough to get the like COO role, like chief operating officer, which I mean, in an early stage startup is basically just like the operations dude. Like it's a fancy title for somebody who does all the stuff no one wants to do. But it's a glorified admin role essentially. But the good thing about being COO is my job was operations, so I had to be involved in marketing, legal, product, engineering, and all these things. And because I didn't have a preconceived notion or any sort of ego around what I already knew, I just immersed myself and learned immensely and loved every second of it. And the funny thing with Vid was it was kind of like one of those Silicon Valley experiences that you see on TV. Like, I mean, we were in LA, but we had this kind of big house where there was about 11 team members that lived in it, and we lived and worked in that house every single day. 12 hours a day, and it was just an insane experience. There was influencers coming to the house, and people in the living room making videos and coding and like doing all those kind of things. And so that was a really, really cool experience to actually live and work in a house with like all the people around you. The CEO lived in the house and all those sort of things. And it was the best and
Mm.
worst experience of my entire life. Like, I mean, we didn't stop working ever because you're around your work colleagues. If you think remote work's bad, live in work is a whole different thing where you all live in the same house. But yeah, it was great. And then it came to COVID. The COVID bear market in crypto happened, and that sort of the CEO decided to end up selling the company to a private equity firm. And it was like LA was a weird place when COVID was going down because like you know people were loading up on ammunition and doing that kind of like American things, and I was like I might just go back to Australia for like 2 weeks. And I ended up staying there for like 11 months. But I went home to Australia and I had a lot of time to sort of reflect on everything, all the journeys I'd kind of been on in the last few years. And being locked down wasn't that bad for me because like I just spent the last year and a half in the vid house, basically locked in the house every single day working. So it wasn't really that unfamiliar. And I took a few friends and we like my family have a farmhouse 5 hours south of Sydney in a place called Mystery Bay. And so 4 of my friends, we just went down there and lived down there. The population's like 60 people. And so we kind of just got to enjoy our lives for a little bit during that phase. We weren't in like big cities where you had a lot of these like much tighter lockdowns, and the beaches were pretty
Mm.
empty down there and whatnot. Anyway, so yeah, during that phase, I wanted to start something new. And something that I'd noticed in the startup world is you have all these incredible tools in terms of like how you actually communicate. And it's actually oftentimes easier to communicate with your work colleagues than it is to people in your real life. And you end up just tending to spend more time at work just because it's like easier. But
Mm.
it's easier for people you and I, to organize a podcast together in different time zones, and we've never met, than it is for my mum to organize a call with me. Like if you just think about that,
Mm.
like she should just be able to press my icon at the top of WhatsApp, see what time zone it is for me, put time in my calendar and catch up. And people say like, oh, like your mum or your friend should just be able to call you out of the blue. Like, yes, that's true. But if you call me and I'm in the middle of work or something, I'm not present. Like I focus to such an extent that it takes a little bit of unwinding to come out and focus on what someone's saying. And I
Mm.
don't know if you have a similar experience in that way. Like when someone
Yeah.
calls you and you're like in the middle of like coding something or whatever, you're not there. You're like, yeah, anyway, like what's up? But if someone's got a meeting with
Yeah.
you stop what you're doing to go and take that call, right? Like I've been working all
Mm.
day. I saw that I have a call with you. I stop what I'm doing so that I can be present with you and have a proper conversation. And I think that's where scheduled conversations are kind of undervalued. But we took that a little bit further. We were like, how do people organize events? How do people organize trips? How do people actually get together? How do people communicate? And I was like, how do we bring some of these lessons that we've taken from the business world about how to run a really coherent team and then bring that into your sort of social and family lives? Like the depth of relationships you build in
Mm,
startups and work and stuff like that. The reason is because you work on these projects together, you organize things together, you communicate efficiently together. And so I was like, how can we take these lessons and sort of bring them down into this sort of consumer social world, not make it feel worky, but take these principles and distill them down into a product. And then, yeah, I'd also spent a bit of time. We had a team in China at Vid, so I'd used WeChat a number of different times, and I sort of saw
mm.
how inferior the chat products were in the West compared to how WeChat worked, and took a lot of lessons from that and sort of brought that over. So I know that was a long winded answer, but I wanted to offer you the sort of like full context of how we
Mm.
ended up here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Graduate Theory. If you haven't already subscribed to the Graduate Theory newsletter, you can do so via the links in the show notes. The Graduate Theory newsletter comes out every single Tuesday morning with my thoughts and lessons from each episode. But without further ado, let's get back into it.
Yeah, definitely. It's pretty interesting, and certainly like a really cool journey that you're on. And seeking to change chat is like a no easy feat, right? It's quite a big thing to take on. And I'm curious to ask, how do you like sort of stay the course when you are taking on like, I mean, from my perspective, this is like quite a big thing, right? We're trying to like sort of become like like the best chat app in the West, essentially. How do you like what drives you to sort of persist with this goal and keep going?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we're sort of going against the grain of what you should do in a startup. Like everyone will always tell you, like, pick one small thing and monopolize on that target audience. And then, pick one little
Mm,
niche and go into that niche. And we're kind of doing the opposite to that. I kind of have a contrarian view. I think that's an old idea, like in the sense, and this sort of also like lean startup methodology. It's like an old idea in the sense that, if you think about like, there's like hundreds of thousands of apps on the App Store, and you probably use five or six on a daily or weekly basis, right? And if you look
mm,
at the five or six that you use every single day, they probably do more than one thing. In that sense, they're usually multifunctional apps. Like if you look at like whether it's Instagram or Facebook or whatever, like they do two or three things or four things or whatever. And what's tending to
mm,
happen is that people are building these sort of smaller products, and then these bigger companies are just buying them. And I found like a lot of products that were being built, they weren't really businesses; they were features. Like it's
mm,
if, for example, like I don't see split payments as something that should be a whole app. It's a feature to me.
mm,
I don't see like for example, like a something like Calendly is weird to me. Like it's a feature that should just be inside Google Calendar. Like I don't understand how that's a
mm,
standalone product. It doesn't make any sense. Um, and so I sort of had that methodology initially. I also, I don't know, like the size of it's exciting. It's like what makes you want to
yeah, yeah.
wake up and do it every day. And you're just like,
Mm,
it's so incredible now that we've sort of designed the product out and I see it and I just know that it needs to exist. And you sort of, the cool thing is it's not like we've just picked these features out of thin air and I'm like, oh, I want to have this balloon there and this balloon there and whatever. Like each of these features is kind of like in sync with the other. And like it's the sum of their parts makes them all greater. It's kind of like the
mm,
iPhone isn't just like a compass, internet, an iPod, and a phone, right? Like it's when you combine all of those feature sets, you sort of unlock these experiences that people have sort of never been able to uh, produce before because you didn't have these like connections. Now, how do we
mm,
stay on track? It's very, very difficult. Like I'll be direct with you. Like there's a benefit where it's exciting enough to wake up every day and do it, where you're like, yes, this is interesting, and you can tell people about the vision, and investors get excited and whatever. And then it's another thing to like start to product manage this beast and go, how are we actually going to get this done with our smaller team and our tiny amount of funding that we've got compared to these juggernauts? Like we've raised a decent amount of funding from my perspective, but
mm.
some of these companies that we're going up against have more money than the US government. And so that's like that's an incredibly daunting task, but I don't think that's an excuse to uh, shy away from that. And uh, at this, you just keep going over these hurdles where you have that sort of Dunning Kruger effect, where at the start you're like, yes, this is a brilliant idea, and then you go down into like the valley of despair, and you're like, oh my god, like what have I got myself into? But you just hit milestone after milestone. You raise your first check, you get your first product out, you get your first user, you raise more money, you hire more team members, you build more feature sets, and you just keep solving problems to the extent where you're like, wow, like you generate so much momentum that it's you get to a stage where it's harder to not do it than to do it. And that's like a cool
Mm,
framework to get to, where you're in a position where it would right now would be harder for me to stop than to keep going in that
yeah.
sense. Like we've built up so much momentum in terms of where we need to be, that I would have to work hard to go the other way, which is
Mm,
kind of a strange uh, thing that you sort of end up in.
yeah. No, it's cool that you're excited about what you're doing, and like that the passion is definitely there, which I think is so important. I think like often young people today, and I think it's maybe a trend that's um, starting to come up, is like people are now, I think, a bit more concerned about having a mission and having the positive impact on the world, rather than being manager at a bank, for example,
Yeah, I
where
think
like it's not super clear like what are you actually, like what benefit are you providing, you know what I mean? And
my
so
business
yeah,
partner and I used to call Nab the Pit. And have you like you've obviously seen Batman, like the I can't remember which one it is, but the one with Bane. And where like Batman goes into the pit and like he has to like get out of like the well or whatever.
yeah,
Like we can like you have to go and work at some of these big companies, because even though they suck, uh you learn so many lessons, like in terms of how to interact, how to write emails, how to raise money, how to interact with high net worth individuals, and you actually become the type of person that can, like, it's one thing to have a mission, right? But it's another thing to
mm,
be the type of person that can actually fulfill that mission, right?
mm,
The mission's useless unless you're somebody who has the skills to actually be able to go and make that mission possible. And I think uh, a lot of people have different views on Gary Vee. I don't follow him that closely, but one thing I do like about Gary Vee is his understanding of how long life is. And I always have to remind myself of this, in the sense of like, you sometimes when you're young, you're in such a rush to fulfill your mission, in that sense, where
mm,
you don't realize how long 10 years is. Like if I think about 10 years ago, I was working at McDonald's and like at uni and trying to like get by, and I was a manager at McDonald's, and going clubbing every second weekend or whatever it was. Um and so you think about what happened over the next 10 years, and then I'm like, man, like when I'm like 38, 39, that's like that whole period, except I have all these lessons and skills. So it's like and the compound interest of that is like an order of magnitude higher. But at the time, it's so
mm,
hard to see those things, and to be able to think long term in that aspect. And so I've been lucky to have really great mentors and work around people who have like supported me and backed me and taught me. And the problem is, like, sometimes when you're younger and you have a mission, you don't know what you don't know. Like, you don't actually realize in some capacities how sort of naive you are, or how long life can be in some capacity, and how hard certain things are, and whatever it may be. And so I think it can't be understated in terms of going and doing a shitty job sometimes. Like working at McDonald's is literally like, and like you're doing like you're doing like $10,000 hours or something like that, with 14-year-olds as your staff member, who like
mm.
are telling you to go. I don't know if you're allowed to swear in here, but like they're telling you to go fuck yourself, basically. And and they don't want to do anything, and you're trying to like rally them up, and they're getting paid like $10 an hour or something like that for cheeseburgers, and you're trying to get them excited about their job. That's hard, right? Like and you have people complaining to you that it's taking you too long to like make orders and stuff. I'm like, excuse me, like, can you feed a family? I dare you to go home and try and feed your family of four in 3 minutes. I dare you to do it.
Yeah.
And get your 12-year-old son to do the cooking, right?
Yeah.
Like it's remarkable. And so I think these, I dude, like I every time I go into a McDonald's store, I'm like salute it. That's
Yeah.
fun stuff. My job today is so easy, like compared to that.
Yeah.
So I think those things offer you a lot of perspective. Like a lot of
Mm,
people say, how do you deal with the stress and like all that kind of stuff? This isn't stressful to a Friday night compared to a Friday night shift at McDonald's. I think those kind of perspectives are important, and you only learn them from. Like I always think about, I have an engineer in my team who I hired basically straight out of uni, and I think about
mm,
Nolan a lot. Like Nolan grinds and he works his ass off, which is the most beautiful thing. But like sometimes people get into these working for a startup is epic. Like you get these really good work life balances and epic perks and like all these kind of things that's incredibly exciting and fun.
mm,
You don't get that at McDonald's or NAB or whatever. And so you kind of
mm,
it's sort of nice to know what sucks. Like those people who uh grow up in like low socioeconomic environments, and they're incredibly hard, and that they appreciate what they have and whatever. Like I
mm.
think you can kind of artificially create that by having a shitty job at some point in your life. It's kind of important to give you perspective later on when you're working in different environments by yourself.
Yeah, that was really funny and really interesting to hear.
I've
um,
never said that out loud, so thank you for drawing that out, but
yeah.
it's an important point.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. No, I think, yeah, I like the point there, like you said about sometimes like the doing things that aren't so good gives you perspective and like allows you to kind of almost enjoy the good things more. If you've seen kind of things that aren't so good, like working at Macca's on a Friday night or whatever it
But
is. I
like
think
it's
that's really
it's so
cool.
important, right? Like my job at McDonald's was to make sure that like the back area had enough meat and nuggets for the like enough meat and chicken and stuff, so that when we went into a rush, that we wouldn't run out, and the order taker had enough cash in her drawer, and that the order taker had somebody taking orders as well, and we had enough people at the front, and everyone was positioned right. Like it's not that different to a startup. Like I have to make sure that the engineers have all of their designs, and the designers have all of their product specs, and the marketing team is interacting with the designers and the engineers. And because like at McDonald's, you have to make sure all of those jobs come together so that you can produce a quality product at the end. It's kind of just like a microorganism of like what you're doing at a grand scale in a startup, except the end result is like a cheeseburger in a bag that you hand to somebody
Mm,
instead of producing an app in that sense.
yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk about your engineering experience at work and kind of and not only that, but kind of the learning that goes along with you know going from NAB to where you are now and all the things you've had to learn in that time. I know like one thing we spoke about before this was like learning your engineering stuff and kind of how you don't come from like you didn't study computer science at uni, but like having to learn that has been really beneficial and a really great part of what you do. Um, I'd love to just talk about like all the things you've had to learn over this period and kind of what has been some of the like looking back now some of the really important things that you have learned on your journey to where you are now and kind of what those are and yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to be specific in the engineering environment to start with. My engineers would probably roll over laughing, that people would say that I have some sort of an engineering base, but I I take it as an incredible compliment. I've spent a lot of time to try and have a deep enough understanding of that environment, and I didn't study as an engineer. I wasn't trained as an engineer, and all these kind of things. And I wouldn't even call myself an engineer. But what I would say proudly is like I've spent a lot of time to understand engineering. I've also done that in design as well. That's kind of the benefit of being a COO. As I mentioned before, you actually get to spend a lot of time in different environments. But I think a lot of us who don't design or aren't engineers or don't have those sort of skill sets or backgrounds, or if you're a designer and or if you're an engineer, we tend to have this kind of like imposter syndrome that we're not smart enough to sort of understand what they do. And like sometimes people uh, oftentimes you'll find if you speak to people, they'll doubt you, and they kind of make it sound like more complicated than it might be. I heard
Mm,
Jacqueline Novogratz talk about this, and it really made a difference in my career. Is like she made a career out of asking like stupid questions, and you sort of like continue to pull the string, like in that sense. You
mm,
know, I'm a pretty intelligent person. I wouldn't say like I'm the smartest person in the world, but like if I read something or someone explains something to me, I can generally understand it. And so what I've learned in my life is if somebody can't explain something to me, then they either don't understand it or they're lying, right? The best
Mm.
people in the world who care and who are doing the right thing by you, if they know what they're talking about, the definition of basically knowing what you're talking about is that you could explain it to somebody else, right? Like if you
Mm.
know what you're talking about, you can teach somebody. And so if somebody's not willing to teach you, you probably shouldn't be around them anyway, or they're lying to you,
Mm.
or they don't know what they're talking about. And so it's been like an interesting thing for me, like because the first principles of design and engineering and all of these kind of things, they have a lot of similarities. And like you don't actually have to understand each line of code or whatever it is, but taking a lot of time to understand why things are hard, what's like, and then you start to draw these parallels when you've been doing it enough. You're like, yeah, but we did that speech bubble thing the other day that had media, and you said it was hard for this reason. So why would video be hard? Because isn't video just like moving pictures? I'm just giving like a dumb example, but you
Yeah.
know my point. Like you
Mhm.
start to get your own understanding, and you can challenge people on what they're saying because you're like, hang on a
Mm.
second, I understood what you were saying before, which means that if I understood that, the thing that you're saying now doesn't make any sense, right? So, and
Mm.
you start to, the more questions you ask and the more inquisitive you become, you build up this knowledge base where you can actually be somebody who can have like bring an intelligent perspective to the conversation. And I think CEOs and people who would consider themselves non-creative or non-technical, they're lazy when they don't spend the time with their team and ask them why they're making the decisions they're making, right? Like our whole product is design and engineering. If I don't spend time learning what it means to be a
Mm.
designer and an engineer, like how can I do my job right? And also how can I get my team to respect me? Like and not respect me in the sense that like I'm the leader and you need to do what I say, but why should they care about what I think if I don't understand what they do? Um, and so I think
Mm.
that's a really, really undervalued piece of the job. I think the other thing as well is like if you're not technical and or you're not a designer and you don't understand how hard things are, you can be that like sort of ignorant CEO where you're like, get that done in 2 weeks and I want it done or you're fired. And it's like, yeah, but like where like you just pulled that time frame out of your ass. Like you actually have no
Mm.
idea how hard that is, what that person's skill set is, what's possible, how many resources they need. You couldn't have an intelligent conversation with them. Like you're just being like a tyrannic dictator and just throwing a random time frame out, which is incredibly dangerous because like I, you have this sort of like romanticism in startups where everyone's like, you have that you see the in the movies where they make their team work like they make their team work like 9 hours a day, 7 days a week to like push out a feature set or something like that. You can think of
Mm.
that about that romantically, right? And I think about this like I do a bit of long distance running. Okay, so like if you say you're training for a marathon, right? You might be able to do one marathon a month. Okay, so you burn your and then you need to rest after that marathon so that you can recover or whatever. You burn your team out, then you need to let them rest. Okay, or
Mm.
say they do they can do a marathon a month or they can do 5Ks a day for 25 days, right? A marathon's 42 kilometers, 5Ks a day for 25 days, 100 kilometers. I like in terms of if you think about that as like the product evolution, I would rather them do 100 kilometers worth of um, product development than smash them to work aggressively for that to push out that marathon effort. It's more that consistent cadence. But in order
Mm.
to build a consistent cadence, you have to actually understand their job and be able to step out your product roadmap in a really sophisticated way. So I would never ever say that I'm an engineer or a designer or anything like that, but I can proudly say that I have spent a lot of time understanding these sort of areas of the business so that I can be a good leader and work reasonably with my team without, it's offensive. Like when you question them on things that you have no idea what you're talking about. You're like, how isn't this done yet? Why haven't you done this in this time frame? Like, what do you know? You don't know
Mm.
anything. Like, in that sense, it's like
Mm.
and you don't want to be that guy is
Mm.
something to sort of think about. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it does definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great, great point there. I think one question I have for you is around um, like failures and things like that, and I wonder
Okay.
if there's been any. particular failures that you can think of that turned out to be a success later? So is there anything that comes to mind? Yeah, any times where you failed at something, but it ended up working
Um,
out well, or it was
I
actually a
think
good thing to
there's
fail
so many, right? I mean, there's failures in everything that you do. Like I would say in previous relationships, like like romantic partners and stuff, I've failed certain romantic partners, but then became a better partner for every subsequent partner after that. And it's the same in business. Like, we've done well in each business, and my peers and family and friends and stuff like that would consider that we achieved things and we succeeded and whatever. And but there were essences and elements of that we failed at. Uh, you fail in micro ways all the time, and I think those elements of that you keep them as a reminder to keep yourself on track. In terms of huge kind of like failures, I can't think of anything specific um where it's been a failure that has really crushed me as a person, and sent me into like a
Mm,
dark place that I've had to like recover from, or where I've dramatically let people down, or whatever it might be. I think failure is a perspective in many different ways. It depends on what your goal was, right? Like I always one of my favorite quotes that I kind of live by is like, you're entitled to the action and never its fruits. And so like
mm,
for me, if I wake up every day and I live by my values and sort of like my, I guess you'd call it like code of ethics, and I do what I say that I'm going to do to the people that I promised that I would do those things by. It's very difficult to fail. Like I was talking to a VC yesterday, and this would be a good example for a lot of the entrepreneurs out there. I don't know if you guys heard of Fast. It was an
mm,
Australian startup that ended up closing down very recently. They raised a lot of money and whatnot. And this particular investor had invested in Fast. He was one of their early investors, and he said that Dom, the founder of Fast, is working on something soon. And he was like, he's going to show me. And I was like, would you invest again? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, he was like, the way that Dom handled himself as a CEO during that time was incredibly impressive. And he was respectful of his investors. And he did what he said he was going to do at the board meetings. And it just didn't work out. Like, and like
mm,
he didn't lie. And he was like, have you seen Rocky? Like, Rocky doesn't win the title in the first one. He wins it in the second one. And so it's an interesting dynamic. I would say it's hard to say as a failure, but one sort of segue that I could say where I've sort of brought myself up from the ashes was when I was in my early 20s. I suffered really bad anxiety. Um, and it was an incredibly difficult time for me where I was a social person leading into that, and then I went into this place where like I couldn't even go out for dinner with my girlfriend, and I couldn't go to parties, and I found it incredibly difficult to go outside the house. And I was somebody who had already been in the bank, and I was having a lot of early stage success, and like everybody was like, you're gonna have a big career and you're gonna succeed heaps, and then I went into this bout of anxiety where like I found it hard just to do like just the day to day meaningless tasks in that sense. And so coming out of that has kind of, I guess I could call that a failure of in some capacity, but it was a really important. It wasn't a failure. I don't know how to explain it. It just kind of ended
mm,
up there. And I was saying to you before it just came on randomly, but before we had this podcast, like I always used to think that people who had anxiety and depression just needed to kind of like get over it and whatever. And I'd studied a bit of psychology in uni, and I didn't really, but going through it was an important experience for me because I can empathize with people now who have like different mental issues, because I would have never anticipated I'd be the type of person that would have something like that. Um, but how I sort of came out of that was building a really strong relationship with fear and risk. A lot of my anxiety was around fear, and I just started doing stuff that scared me. Like I would feel like I was going to have a heart attack when I would go to the gym and different things like that. And so I
mm,
started to just challenge myself where I was like, okay, I'm just going to go and run like 10 or 20 Ks. And, if we're going to have a heart attack, we'll have a heart attack. We haven't had it till now. And I would, I used to have this concept of like me versus my mind, and I would like my body would be scared about something, and I would just go and do it. Like I would do the thing that I was terrified to do.
Mm.
To the extent when I was in my early 20s, if you asked me to go like tandem skydiving, you couldn't have paid me $1 million to do it. And like the epitome of that journey for me was during COVID. I learned how to skydive solo, and I have a parachute in my closet now and go skydiving from time to time, and it's one of my favorite activities. But that was kind of like the pinnacle of that journey with fear for me. Um, but it taught me a really important lesson in startups, in the sense that our bodies have fear for a reason, to keep us alive, right? So we have to fear something. And so if you don't build a good relationship with fear, it's going to hold you back in many different capacities. And so for some people, what's scary is people seeing them wearing the wrong t-shirt, or posting a photo on Instagram that doesn't get any likes, or whatever it is. But I've trained my body that what's scary is being at 40,000 feet, jumping out of an airplane, or, being deep into like a really long marathon or a triathlon. Like, it's scary when you're at, 38, 39 Ks, and you feel like you're going to die, and like all these kind of things. And so you,
Mm.
you teach your body what is actually scary, like in that sense. And
Mm.
I think it's an undervalued thing in terms of putting yourself in environments that are genuinely fearful. Now, I don't give a shit what people think about what I'm wearing or what I'm doing, or like, like people say, "Oh, like how you're going on that investor call, like, are you nervous? How do you prepare?" It's not scary for me, because like I don't even get that anxious leading into an investor call, because my body like the level of anxiety that I felt sitting in a plane at 40,000 feet and seeing the door open and you have to jump out of an airplane, like getting on a Zoom call with somebody is easy. Like, or like thinking about doing a triathlon, you got to swim like 3 kilometers swim 2 kilometers in like freezing water or whatever. Like, when you
Mm.
do these things that are incredibly difficult and incredibly scary, these trivial things that people think are scary are no longer scary anymore. So I think that's important. I'll just end on that, and it's not an answer to your question on failure, but I thought this was a funny thing that Jesse Itzler said the other day. When you're younger, you tend to compare what other people are doing and worry about what other people think, and that's an important thing about doing a startup, is everyone will tell you you're wrong and everyone will tell you you're stupid, right? So you have to be able to get through that. But Jesse Itzler was talking about how like how much people don't think about you, and everyone says this, right? Everyone's like, no one's thinking about you, but he put it in a perspective I've never heard of before. He was like, I use my iPhone every single day, right? Like, I use it 6 hours a day, whatever. He's like, do you know how often I think about Steve Jobs? Right? Like, think
Mm.
about that for a second. Like, you use his product 24/7, like, he's changed your entire life. How
Mm.
often do you think about Steve Jobs? Like,
Mm.
never. And
Yeah.
the Wright brothers like invented the aeroplane, right? And that you think about legacy and all these kind of things, right? Whenever you're on an airplane, are you thinking about how amazing the Wright brothers are and how they created this airplane for you? No, you're like sitting there like worried about, whenever they're going to bring a glass of water, or I don't know, whatever stupid movies on, like, is Men in Black on the TV or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an incredibly important mindset to get into. Like, in
Mm.
that sense, like, it's easy to think about, like, everyone always says no one cares what you think, but think about the people that you actually think about. Like, and these people who have like fundamentally changed the world in its entire capacity, you don't even think about them. Like,
Mm.
it's just like like, when was the last time
Yeah.
you thought about Winston Churchill, right? Winston Churchill saved the world, like,
Yeah.
from like disaster. Like, JFK saved the world from like nuclear disaster. When was the last time you were like, man, JFK is such a good dude?
Yeah.
Never. Right? So it's really important to not take yourself that seriously, because no one's going to think about you, regardless of,
Yeah.
even if I build this app and I get 1 billion users and do all these things, no one gives a shit, like, in reality. So that's kind of like a relationship that you kind of have to build.
Yeah. No, that's a really good way to put it. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. I liked I think there's like a bit of a thread there between like, the hard things leading to good or better experiences, like you said, with the running and things like that, putting yourself in difficult situations so it's easier to, well, it's not easier, but it puts it in perspective. You know, these other situations similar to like the Maccas, having that hard experience makes like, the
Well, if you think about
less
it,
bad experience. Yeah.
most things aren't that hard, right? Because your perception of what it's going to take. Like in theory, when you're talking to a venture capitalist, you're just having a conversation, right? You have conversations every single day. Like it's
Mm.
just a conversation, but you've created a story around that conversation that makes it hard. So in some capacity, most things are easier than you think. It's the amount of anxiousness and procrastination and all that kind of stuff that you apply to it that adds the weight in that capacity. I mean, there's hard things, but like it tends to be funny. Like the things that you obsess over usually aren't worth it in that capacity.
So I've got one question left for you, and that is, it's a question I ask all the guests that come on the show, and it is, if you were looking at the Robby that's just finished university and is about to sort of go out into the world and tackle his job, what advice would you give him, sort of knowing what you know now and all the experiences that you've had?
So easy. I would just say read and run every day. Like if you if you read books every day and run every day, I guarantee you, like, your life will change forever. Like, if you just do those two things, even if you start
Mm,
at like a kilometer and a page, they're just those two things are so unique uh, in their capacity. And I'll be very brief on this. Like, reading allows you to get mentors and knowledge and understanding, and you sort of level up your education and whatever. Um, Running's cool because running gets you outside. Getting outside every single day is really, really important for like your circadian rhythm and just your mental well-being. When you run and you run through space and your eyes move, it relaxes you and it makes you incredibly calm. And then also, when you do like cardiovascular exercise, it can actually form like you get like neurogenesis in your hippocampus and allows you to have like a fluffy hippocampus, which increases and improves your memory. So if you're running every day,
mm,
your memory is going to be better. If your memory is better, you're going to be learning more. If you're learning more, you're very likely to you're going to be fit and educated. It's pretty hard to go. It's pretty hard for your life to go south if you just focus on those two things.
mm.
I think everyone can give you all these like weird anecdotes and statements and all those kind of things, but practically, like, try to read and run at least once a day, and I think your life will just transform from there. You learn what you need to do next just by doing those two things.
Bang. No, that's really cool. I absolutely agree with that. Thanks for coming on the show today, Robby. And where can people go to find out more about this app, the app you're building, your life in general? Like, where's the best place for them to find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can go to thisapp.com. So at the moment we're in beta, so you can't actually download the app. We are looking to release it in August. But if you go to thisapp.com, you can claim your username now. So that way you can keep that forever, and it's a good way to lock that down. So jump over there. We're on all the socials like Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and all of those kind of wonderful things. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on any social platform. I'll get back to you. Yeah, look forward to seeing you all on board. Thanks for taking the time, James. It's been great.
Oh, no problem, man. Yeah, no, it's been really cool having you on and hearing your background and your story. Then thanks so much for sharing it with us.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.